Some stories do not announce themselves with sirens or breaking news banners. They begin with a mood shift, a silence that spreads through a room, a moment when laughter drains away and people instinctively know something is wrong. That is how the account connected to Conan O'Brien begins, and why it has left so many viewers unsettled. According to multiple retellings, what unfolded at Conan's holiday party was not just awkward family tension or a heated exchange fueled by alcohol. It was described as something far heavier, a confrontation that felt charged, volatile, and impossible to ignore. Guests did not simply overhear raised voices. They sensed a fracture, the kind that suggests deeper instability rather than a passing argument. At the center of that night were Rob Reiner and his son, Nick Reiner. Rob Reiner, a figure associated for decades with warmth, humor, and humane storytelling, arrived carrying the weight of a father trying to hold something together. Nick, by contrast, was described by witnesses as distant, confrontational, and unsettlingly cold. The dynamic between them reportedly shifted the atmosphere of the entire gathering. Conversation stalled. Smiles froze. People who had spent years navigating Hollywood parties suddenly fell out of their depth, because this was not about status or ego. It was about a family crisis spilling into public view. What has stunned audiences is not only that such a confrontation allegedly happened, but that it happened in front of so many people, including a host as visible and experienced as Conan O'Brien. The story is often framed as what Conan witnessed, because his presence lends gravity. He is not a tabloid figure, nor someone known for exploiting personal tragedy. That alone makes listeners lean in. If something disturbed a room full of seasoned industry veterans, then perhaps the warning signs were unmistakable. Perhaps the danger was already visible, flashing red in plain sight. Yet this is where the story becomes uncomfortable rather than simply dramatic. Viewers are drawn to the idea that someone could have stopped what came next, that a single decision, a single phone call might have changed everything. This instinct is human, but it is also dangerously simple. A holiday party is not an intervention center. Guests are not clinicians. Even when behavior feels alarming, translating that feeling into decisive action is far more complex in real life than it appears in hindsight. The tension between what people sensed and what they believe they could do is what gives this story its haunting power. This is why the account refuses to fade. It is not just about fame or Hollywood mythology. It is about the moment when concern becomes fear, when love and denial blur, and when people later replay a night in their minds, wondering if they missed the last clear signal before everything collapsed. What makes this story linger is not only what allegedly happened at the party, but what it represents psychologically. A public space became a private reckoning, and the boundary between someone being difficult and someone being dangerous blurred in real time. Guests later described a growing sense of unease, the kind that does not come from loud voices alone, but from a mismatch between words, posture, and intent. It is the difference between an argument that burns hot and fades, and one that feels cold, deliberate, and unresolved. In those retellings, Conan O'Brien is not portrayed as a central actor, but as a witness to a moment when the room collectively realized something was off. The focus naturally returns to Rob Reiner, because of what he represents. For decades, Reiner's public image has been built on empathy, collaboration, and moral clarity. His films often revolve around loyalty, friendship, and the quiet strength of human connection. Seeing a man so closely associated with those values reportedly shaken, embarrassed, and afraid at a social gathering is deeply unsettling to audiences. It disrupts the comforting illusion that wisdom, experience, and love are enough to manage every crisis. The alleged confrontation did not look like a father correcting a son. It looked, to some witnesses, like a parent realizing that authority and affection were no longer working. Then there is Nick Reiner, whose reported behavior at the party has been described in ways that immediately raise alarm in hindsight. Accounts emphasize detachment, hostility, and a sense of provocation rather than confusion. He was not according to those stories, seeking comfort or reconciliation. He was testing boundaries, challenging people in the room, and disregarding social cues that normally keep public gatherings safe. This matters because the legal system often draws a sharp line between impulsive chaos and controlled aggression. The way someone behaves before a violent act can later become central to arguments about intent, awareness, and responsibility. The internet, however, has little patience for nuance. Online discussions quickly turn the party into a kind of moral crossroads, a single scene onto which every what-if could be projected. Why did no one step in more forcefully? Why did no one insist on calling emergency services? Why did the night end without intervention? These questions are emotionally satisfying because they suggest that tragedy is preventable if only the right person acts decisively. But real life does not operate on clear scripts. People are often paralyzed by uncertainty, social pressure, and fear of overreacting. Calling for help is not a neutral act. It can escalate situations, damage relationships, and carry legal consequences. In a room full of peers and friends, the threshold for taking that step is far higher than viewers imagine from a distance. This is where the phrase, "what Conan witnessed," becomes so potent and so misleading at the same time. Witnessing does not equal understanding. Seeing someone act strangely does not automatically reveal their inner state or their future actions. The danger of sensational framing is that it turns observers into judges and hosts into gatekeepers of fate. In reality, even trained professionals struggle to predict violent outcomes with certainty. Expecting a comedian hosting a holiday party to make a flawless call in the middle of an emotionally charged family conflict is an unrealistic burden, even if the discomfort in the room was real. What the party symbolizes, then, is not a missed opportunity for heroism, but the limits of social intuition. It exposes how easily people can sense danger without knowing how to respond to it, and how quickly hindsight transforms ambiguity into accusation. The tragedy that followed has retroactively frozen that night in time, turning every glance, every raised voice, and every decision into evidence. But at the moment it happened, it was still just a party, still governed by unspoken rules of politeness, privacy, and restraint. That is why this story continues to resonate. It forces viewers to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes warning signs are visible, and sometimes even when they are, no one knows how to act on them without causing another kind of harm. The horror lies not only in what allegedly came next, but in the realization that human judgment, especially in intimate and public spaces, is fragile, hesitant, and often tragically uncertain. Once the night at the party was over, the story did not end. It hardened. What had felt like an uncomfortable social rupture suddenly became a hinge in a far darker narrative, because within hours the focus shifted from raised voices and uneasy glances to police tape, headlines, and a family tragedy that stunned even a city accustomed to scandal. This is where the meaning of that confrontation deepens, because it stopped being just an anecdote and became a possible prelude. In retrospect, the party was no longer remembered as an isolated incident, but as the last moment when outsiders saw the family dynamic before everything collapsed. When news broke that Rob Reiner and his wife had been found dead in their home, the shock rippled outward in waves. Reiner was not merely a well-known figure. He was a symbol of a certain Hollywood era, one associated with intelligence, warmth, and moral steadiness. The idea that violence could erupt inside a household so closely tied to those values felt almost sacrilegious. Fans and colleagues immediately began searching for explanations that made emotional sense, and the memory of the party rushed back into focus. Suddenly, that argument was no longer awkward. It was ominous. The arrest of Nick Reiner intensified everything. Allegations, not verdicts, but heavy ones, reshaped how every previous detail was interpreted. The way he was described at the party, cold, confrontational, detached, now carried a different weight. In the public imagination, behavior that once seemed strange began to look like a warning sign. This is one of the most dangerous psychological traps in true crime storytelling. The urge to retrofit meaning onto moments that were once ambiguous. Yet it is also unavoidable. Human beings are pattern-seeking by nature, especially when trying to understand something as incomprehensible as violence within a family. Media coverage leaned into this pattern. Reports emphasized timing, proximity, and escalation. Saturday night, an explosive argument. Sunday morning, a devastating discovery. The sequence itself feels cinematic, almost too perfectly aligned, which is precisely why it captured so much attention. It suggests inevitability, as if events were sliding down a slope that could no longer be stopped. But inevitability is a story we tell ourselves after the fact. In reality, families live with tension for years without catastrophe, and moments that feel extreme do not always end in irreversible harm. The danger lies in assuming that a single incident contains the entire truth. Still, the legal system cannot ignore that timing. Prosecutors are expected to examine what happened in the hours leading up to the alleged crime, because behavior close to the event can speak to emotional state, motive, and awareness. Defense attorneys, on the other hand, often focus on mental health, instability, and the possibility that what looked like control or aggression was actually disorganization or crisis. The same facts can support radically different interpretations. This is why the party matters beyond gossip. It may become evidence, testimony, or context in a courtroom, where stories are stripped of mood and reduced to words spoken, actions taken, and witnesses willing to swear to what they saw. The involvement of Conan O'Brien adds another layer. Conan's name does not change the facts of the case, but it changes how the public listens. He is widely perceived as thoughtful, humane, and cautious, not someone prone to exaggeration. That perception has led many viewers to assume that if something disturbed him or unfolded in his home, it must have been serious. Yet even here, restraint is essential. Being present does not make someone responsible, and witnessing distress does not grant prophetic clarity. The narrative risk is turning a host into a symbolic gatekeeper, someone imagined to stand at the threshold between prevention and tragedy. That framing may feel emotionally satisfying, but it is deeply unfair and legally meaningless. What often gets lost in the noise is the slow, grinding reality of families dealing with long-term struggles. Addiction, mental illness, resentment, and fear do not appear overnight. They build quietly, sometimes invisibly, even in households with resources and support. Public success does not insulate private life from fracture. If anything, it can increase pressure to keep problems hidden, to protect reputations, and to maintain an image of stability long after that stability has eroded. In that sense, the party confrontation may not have been the beginning of the crisis at all. It may have been one of the first times it became impossible to conceal. This reframing matters because it shifts the focus away from blame and toward understanding. The most unsettling aspect of this story is not the question of who did what at a party, but the realization that even highly visible, well-connected families can reach a point where love and fear coexist in a dangerous stalemate. The father who tries to protect, the mother who tries to stabilize, the son who resists help or control, all can become trapped in a cycle that feels unbreakable from the inside. Outsiders may sense something is wrong, but without context, authority, or consent, their options are limited. As the case moves forward, facts will matter more than feelings. Evidence, testimony, and forensic analysis will determine what can be proven and what remains speculation. But culturally, the damage is already done. The story has embedded itself in the public consciousness as a cautionary tale about ignored warning signs, about the thin line between concern and denial, and about how quickly a family's private struggle can become a public reckoning. The party, frozen in memory, stands as a symbol of that moment when discomfort was visible but solutions were not. In the end, Part 3 of this story is not about assigning guilt to a room full of guests or elevating a single witness to mythic status. It is about confronting an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the signs are there, sometimes people notice them, and sometimes, even then, tragedy still happens. That realization is far more frightening than any sensational headline, because it strips away the illusion of control and forces us to face the limits of human intervention when pain has already taken root. As the shock settled, the story entered its most dangerous phase, the moment when grief, fear, and public fascination collide with the machinery of law. What had begun as a disturbing account of family confrontation now became a national spectacle, one that threatened to flatten complexity into accusation. Headlines sharpened. Timelines were compressed into neat cause-and-effect arcs. And the name of Conan O'Brien kept appearing alongside the words witnessed and warning, as if proximity alone could assign responsibility. This is where the narrative pressure intensified, not because new facts emerged, but because interpretation rushed ahead of evidence. In legal reality, the case narrowed rather than expanded. Investigators focused on verifiable actions, physical evidence, and testimony that could withstand cross-examination. Emotional impressions from a party, however unsettling, became secondary unless they could be anchored to specific statements or conduct. Prosecutors examine whether behavior demonstrates motive, intent, or awareness. Defense counsel examines whether the same behavior reflects crisis, instability, or diminished capacity. These frameworks are not moral judgments, they are legal tools. The public, however, tends to collapse them into a single question: who failed to stop this? That question may feel urgent, but it rarely maps onto how the law assigns culpability. The internet, meanwhile, filled the gaps with certainty. Clips circulated. Narration hardened into assertion. The party scene was replayed as a fork in the road, the night when a decisive act could have changed history. This framing is seductive because it promises control in a story defined by helplessness. If one moment mattered more than all others, then future tragedies might be prevented by sharper instincts or braver intervention. But that belief confuses visibility with inevitability. It assumes that danger announces itself clearly and that ordinary people can diagnose it correctly under social pressure, uncertainty, and fear of overreach. Consider the position of Rob Reiner in these retellings. He is cast simultaneously as a powerful figure and a powerless parent. That contradiction is uncomfortable, which is why audiences keep circling it. Power in public does not translate to power in private, especially when the conflict involves a child and long-standing emotional bonds. The party confrontation, as described by witnesses, suggests a father attempting to reassert order while realizing that the familiar tools of authority and affection were no longer effective. That realization is not dramatic in the cinematic sense. It is devastating in the human sense. It leaves people frozen between action and hope, unsure which will do more harm. Then there is Nick Reiner, whose alleged actions sit at the center of the legal process. At this stage, he is an accused individual, not a convicted one. That distinction matters, even when emotions run high. Public narratives that portray him as either a calculating villain or a helpless victim risk undermining the very principles meant to ensure a fair trial. The law must determine what happened, how it happened, and why, based on evidence rather than atmosphere. Party anecdotes may inform context, but they do not replace forensic analysis, witness consistency, and procedural rigor. As coverage expanded, another uncomfortable issue emerged: the ethics of amplification. When stories hinge on alleged mental health crises, addiction, or family conflict, repetition can do harm. It can stigmatize, oversimplify, and turn deeply personal suffering into consumable drama. The more the party story was retold, the more it became a proxy for broader fears about untreated illness and unchecked volatility. Yet those fears are often addressed poorly when filtered through sensational formats. Awareness becomes accusation. Concern becomes blame. The complexity of intervention, consent, and care is flattened into a single verdict rendered by strangers online. This is where the figure of the host becomes symbolically overloaded. Conan O'Brien did not create the conflict, did not control its outcome, and did not possess special authority to resolve it. But the cultural impulse to identify a last gatekeeper persists. It is easier to imagine a door that should have been closed than to accept that some trajectories are shaped by forces long in motion. By turning a host into a hinge of destiny, the story offers a false comfort. That vigilance alone is sufficient. In reality, prevention is systemic, gradual, and often invisible when it works. When it fails, it looks obvious only in retrospect. The legal process now moves slowly, deliberately, and largely out of view. That slowness frustrates audiences accustomed to instant resolution, but it serves a purpose. It protects against exactly the kind of narrative acceleration that can corrupt truth. Evidence will be weighed. Motions will be argued. Experts may testify about mental state, behavior patterns, and risk assessment. None of that will resemble the clean arc of a viral video. It will be fragmented, technical, and resistant to moral shortcuts. Culturally, however, the damage is already embedded. The story has become a parable about warning signs and missed chances, about how love can coexist with fear, and about the limits of intervention in intimate crises. It resonates because it refuses to offer a villain that feels safe to condemn without remainder. Even those who feel certain about blame are haunted by the broader implication that many families live with similar tensions, unseen and unresolved, without the resources or visibility to attract concern before it is too late. Part 4, then, is about restraint. It asks what we owe the truth when emotions are raw and attention is relentless. It challenges the instinct to transform witnesses into judges and hosts into saviors. It insists that justice is not a performance and that understanding does not come from louder narration. The party may remain a symbol, but symbols should not substitute for facts. In the end, the most responsible response to this chapter is not certainty, but humility. The recognition that even when signs appear, outcomes are not always preventable by individuals acting alone. The recognition that law must move at its own pace, indifferent to outrage. And the recognition that stories like this demand care, because behind every headline are people whose lives have been irrevocably altered. That care is not weakness. It is the only stance that preserves truth when the temptation to simplify is strongest. As the legal process unfolds in silence, the public story grows louder, and that imbalance creates its own kind of distortion. Courtrooms move carefully, bound by rules, evidence, and due process. Media narratives, by contrast, move emotionally, pulled by outrage, empathy, and the need for meaning. In this space, the case surrounding Rob Reiner, Nick Reiner, and the night at Conan O'Brien's party becomes less about facts and more about what society wants the story to teach. That desire for a lesson is understandable, but it is also where danger creeps in. One of the most powerful themes emerging from public discussion is mental health, specifically the fear that untreated or poorly managed struggles can spiral beyond anyone's control. Commentators have seized on reports about Nick Reiner's prior issues, treatment attempts, and behavior patterns, weaving them into a narrative of inevitability. This framing suggests a straight line from instability to violence, a line that is emotionally compelling but scientifically and ethically flawed. Most people who struggle with mental illness or addiction are not violent, and reducing complex human behavior to a single diagnosis risks reinforcing stigma rather than promoting understanding. Yet tragedy tempts simplification because complexity offers no comfort. At the same time, the story exposes how families can become trapped in cycles of protection and denial. Parents often believe that love, patience, and resources will eventually be enough. They fear that calling authorities or forcing intervention will destroy trust forever. In many cases, that fear is not irrational. Intervention can be traumatic. It can fracture relationships beyond repair. Families are left to navigate impossible choices with incomplete information and no guarantee that any option will lead to safety. The Reiner case, as presented publicly, has become a mirror for those anxieties, reflecting the terror of realizing too late that good intentions may not be sufficient. This is why the party scene continues to dominate discussion. It functions as a symbolic checkpoint, the last moment when outsiders were present before everything collapsed. But symbols can be misleading. They compress time and responsibility into a single image, erasing the long history that precedes any crisis. Whatever happened at that gathering did not arise in a vacuum. It was likely the visible crest of waves that had been building for years, shaped by personal history, emotional strain, and unresolved conflict. Treating the party as the origin of the tragedy oversimplifies a process that was almost certainly gradual and deeply rooted. The role of bystanders is another uncomfortable theme. People ask what guests should have done, as if courage alone could have overridden uncertainty. In reality, bystanders are constrained by social norms, legal ambiguity, and fear of escalation. Calling emergency services is not a neutral act. It can trigger involuntary holds, police involvement, and consequences that are difficult to reverse. Expecting friends or colleagues to make perfect decisions under emotional pressure ignores the reality that even trained professionals struggle with these judgments. The impulse to assign blame to bystanders often reflects our own fear that we would not know what to do either. The amplification of the story also raises ethical questions about storytelling itself. When tragedy becomes content, the line between awareness and exploitation blurs. Repetition can turn pain into spectacle, and speculation can harden into belief. Each retelling risks stripping nuance away, leaving behind a simplified morality play. For the families involved, this process can feel like a second violation, as private suffering is dissected by strangers who will never bear its consequences. Responsible storytelling requires resisting the urge to fill gaps with certainty and acknowledging what remains unknown. Another layer of complexity comes from the intersection of fame and privacy. Public figures live under the assumption that their lives are open to scrutiny, but that scrutiny often extends unfairly to their families. The expectation that wealth, access, or influence should translate into control over deeply personal struggles is both unrealistic and cruel. Fame does not grant immunity from dysfunction, nor does it provide a manual for handling crises. In some cases, it may even intensify pressure to conceal problems, delaying intervention until options narrow dangerously. As Part 5 unfolds, the narrative shifts from shock to reflection. The initial question of what happened gives way to what does this reveal about us? It reveals our hunger for warning signs that can be neatly identified and acted upon. It reveals our discomfort with ambiguity and our tendency to rewrite the past into a story of missed chances. It reveals how quickly empathy can turn into accusation when fear demands a target. And it reveals how poorly society equips families to handle severe crises before they reach a breaking point. The legal system will eventually deliver its own answers, bounded by evidence and law. Those answers may not satisfy the emotional questions people are asking, because courts determine responsibility, not meaning. Meaning is negotiated culturally through stories we tell and lessons we claim. The danger lies in allowing those lessons to become prescriptive without humility. Declaring that someone should have acted without acknowledging uncertainty does not prepare us for future crises. It merely reassures us that we are different, more alert, more capable than those who were there. That reassurance is comforting, but it may be false. In the end, Part 5 is about confronting limits. The limits of foresight, the limits of love, and the limits of individual responsibility. It is about recognizing that tragedy often emerges from a convergence of factors rather than a single failure. If this story teaches anything worth carrying forward, it is not that vigilance guarantees safety, but that silence, stigma, and isolation make danger harder to see and address. The challenge is to build systems of support that do not rely on perfect judgment in moments of crisis, but on sustained care long before those moments arrive. That lesson is quieter than outrage and slower than speculation, but is the only one that honors the complexity of what has been lost. As the case moves deeper into the legal process, a quieter but more consequential conversation begins to surface, one that has little to do with celebrity and everything to do with responsibility. The public fascination with what happened at the party hosted by Conan O'Brien gradually gives way to harder questions about how society responds to visible distress before it becomes catastrophic. This shift matters because it reframes the story from a hunt for a single moment of failure to an examination of long-term gaps in care, communication, and intervention. One of the most persistent misconceptions in cases like this is the belief that danger announces itself clearly and decisively. In reality, warning signs are often fragmented and contradictory. A person may appear volatile one moment and composed the next. Families may see improvement where outsiders see risk. Professionals may disagree on severity, timing, and appropriate response. The human mind craves clarity, but crisis rarely provides it. That ambiguity is precisely what makes prevention so difficult, and why retrospective certainty can feel both compelling and cruel. The story surrounding Nick Reiner has repeatedly circled back to mental health, not as an explanation, but as a battleground. On one side are voices demanding accountability, emphasizing behavior that appears deliberate and controlled. On the other are voices stressing instability, crisis, and the possibility of diminished capacity. These positions are often framed as mutually exclusive, when in reality they are not. The law routinely grapples with situations where planning and impairment coexist, where a person can function outwardly while unraveling internally. Reducing that complexity to slogans does a disservice to both justice and understanding. Equally important is the role of family systems. Families are not neutral observers. They are emotionally invested participants. Love, fear, loyalty, and hope shape decisions in ways that logic alone cannot. Parents often cling to incremental progress, interpreting small improvements as signs that patience will eventually pay off. They worry that forceful intervention will cause irreparable harm, pushing a loved one further away. These dynamics are not weaknesses. They are human responses to unbearable choices. Yet, without external support, they can also allow risk to persist unchecked. This is where institutions matter. Mental health care, addiction treatment, and crisis intervention are most effective when they are accessible, coordinated, and proactive. When they're fragmented, expensive, or stigmatized, families are left to improvise. In such conditions, bystanders at a party are an unlikely last line of defense. Expecting them to act as emergency arbiters ignores the systemic failures that place that burden on them in the first place. The uncomfortable truth is that prevention cannot rest on intuition in social settings. It requires infrastructure that engages long before tension spills into public view. The fixation on the party also obscures another reality. Many crises unfold without witnesses. Most families dealing with severe instability do so behind closed doors, without the visibility that triggers concern from outsiders. If public attention is reserved only for moments that intersect with fame, then countless others remain invisible and unaddressed. The lesson, then, is not to scrutinize parties more closely, but to strengthen everyday pathways to help, so that escalation is less likely regardless of who is watching. As the narrative matures, empathy becomes more difficult but more necessary. Empathy does not mean excusing harm or abandoning accountability. It means resisting the urge to simplify people into roles, villain, victim, or savior. Rob Reiner has been remembered publicly for his creative legacy and moral clarity. In this story, he also appears as a parent navigating fear and hope under immense strain. Holding both truths simultaneously is uncomfortable, but it is essential. tragedy rarely fits into clean moral compartments. The broader cultural impact of this case lies in how it challenges assumptions about control. Wealth, education, and access do not guarantee safety. Visibility does not ensure intervention. Good intentions do not always prevent disastrous outcomes. These realizations are unsettling because they undermine the belief that careful living offers protection from chaos. Yet acknowledging them is the first step toward more honest conversations about risk and care. Part 6, then, is not about resolution. It is about recalibration. It asks whether society is willing to move beyond blame and toward preparation, whether it can invest in systems that support families before crises peak, and whether it can talk about mental health without turning every discussion into a referendum on violence. The answers to these questions will not emerge from a courtroom alone. They will emerge from policy, community, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths without turning away. In the shadow of this case, the most meaningful response may be the quietest one. Recognizing that prevention is collective, that responsibility is shared, and that care must be continuous rather than reactive. Only then does the story move beyond tragedy towards something that might, one day, prevent another family from reaching the same breaking point. In the end, what remains is not a clean conclusion, but a quiet reckoning. Stories like this resist closure because they expose truths that do not resolve neatly. The night at the party, the days that followed, and the questions that still echo have become symbols of something larger than any single household. They force us to confront how fragile the boundaries are between concern and fear, privacy and intervention, love and danger. And they remind us that even when warning signs feel visible, certainty is rarely available in the moment it is needed most. The presence of Conan O'Brien in this story has often been overstated, not because he lacks relevance, but because people want a witness who feels trustworthy, someone onto whom responsibility can be projected. Yet the deeper truth is that no host, no friend, no room full of observers can substitute for systems designed to recognize and respond to crisis over time. Expecting a single night to carry the weight of prevention is a comforting illusion, one that allows society to avoid examining the slower failures that precede disaster. For Rob Reiner, the legacy that endures is not defined by the final chapter of his life. It is defined by decades of work that emphasized empathy, connection, and the belief that people matter. That belief did not disappear in private. If anything, it may have made the choices he faced more painful, because caring deeply can blur judgment when fear enters the equation. Remembering him only through the lens of tragedy would be a disservice to the values he spent a lifetime expressing. For Nick Reiner, the path forward will be determined by courts, evidence, and law, not by online verdicts. Whatever the outcome, the case underscores how dangerous it is to collapse complex human struggles into simple narratives. Accountability and compassion are not opposites. They are both necessary, and neither is served by certainty that outruns facts. What this story ultimately asks of its audience is restraint. Restraint in judgment, restraint in storytelling, and restraint in the urge to assign meaning too quickly. Tragedy tempts us to believe that clearer thinking or braver action would have guaranteed safety. Sometimes that is true. Often it is not. Accepting that ambiguity is uncomfortable, but it is also honest. If there is a lesson worth carrying forward, it is not about parties or witnesses. It is about the need for sustained attention to mental health, open conversation without stigma, and support structures that do not rely on moments of crisis to activate. Prevention rarely looks dramatic. When it works, nothing happens and no one notices. That is precisely why it is undervalued. The story does not end with answers, but with responsibility. Responsibility to talk earlier, to listen longer, and to build systems that make intervention possible before fear hardens into inevitability. In that sense, remembering this case is not about reliving its horror. It is about refusing to let its complexity be reduced to spectacle. and choosing instead to let it sharpen our awareness of how fragile and how precious human bonds truly are.